I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for our second panel, Alexandra Langlais, who is a professor at the University of Rennes, and she's also presenting a paper actually on ecosystem services during the colloquium on, I think it's Wednesday afternoon. So if you can't get enough ecosystem services, there'll be more during the colloquium itself. Alexandra.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And now I am responsible for ensuring respect of time, and for this session, about payment for ecosystem services. We have at first Emmanuel Kazimbazi from the University of Uganda, and the title of his communication is Payment for Ecosystem Services, a pathway for environmental conservation in Uganda. And after, for the second communication, Solange Teles da Silva and Daniele de Ouro Mamed from the University of Amazonia of Brazil present a communication entitled Forest, Protected Areas and the Payment for Ecosystem Services, Reserva do Juma. And now you can start if you want. You have 20 minutes.
Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank people who have managed by coming here. I would like to thank Melissa and Lauza for accepting my abstract. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here presenting this paper. And I would like to thank my sponsors, the IUCN Academy Secretariat, which funded my travel here. Actually, I thought I would not make it, but Winnie was the bearer of good news. I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, that they were able to get some funding to enable me to travel to this place. And I'm honored to be here because I spent 6 months as a Fulbright scholar at this law school. So I'm glad to be home, and that's why I was really wishing that I should come back and participate in this conference. So my presentation, as the chair has said, I will be dealing with payment of ecosystem services and really a pathway for environmental conservation in Uganda. I'm from Uganda. I teach at the faculty of now the School of Law, Carey University, and where I teach environmental law to both undergraduates and graduate students. I need to start by talking about ecosystems services in Uganda. I'm sure some of you may not know where Uganda is or what Uganda is. Uganda is a country really that is gifted by nature because of its geographical location. It has glacier-topped mountains like Mount Rwenzori. It has tropical rainforests. It has vast lakes. Rivers. It is the source, of River Nile, and it has wetlands. And actually, it is because of that it was called the Pearl of Africa by the British World II Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, when he visited Uganda. And actually, he was so impressed that Uganda is so beautiful that he could only describe it as the Pearl. And that's why actually Uganda is the Pearl of Africa. So when I'm discussing the payment of ecosystem services, it's really right for Uganda because we have the ecosystem that must be paid for. So as a way of, maybe this should have come earlier, but my structure of the presentation, I will, of course, I've already introduced. Then I will attempt to define what ecosystem services are and the benefits, and go through the legal and policy framework, and try to give you some projects that have attempted to implement the payment of ecosystem services, and look at the challenges. Then look at the conclusion and come up with strategies that can be implemented to achieve environmental conservation. Now, that is the map of Uganda. As you can see, very beautiful. So many lakes, always green. As you can see, it is a landlocked country. Sudan in the north, in the east, the west, there is Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda. But the most important thing, as you can see, it has lakes and rivers and national parks, and it is indeed a very beautiful country. Now, what is payment of ecosystem services? When we are having tea, somebody was asking me whether I'm an expert in ecosystem services. I said, no, I'm not an expert, but I have an interest, because it's a very important area as far as Uganda is concerned. So in the technical way, the payment of ecosystem services would mean where really the buyers, such as companies or governments, organizations, are able and willing to pay for the conservation of specific ecosystem services, and there must be a seller and local communities who will exchange for financial benefit to maintain a certain ecosystem service. So in other words, you are paying to maintain or to preserve an ecosystem. Then types of ecosystem services, they are the direct ones, or the ones that are common or well known, like the carbon sequestration and storage, which would involve carbon development mechanism, which I'm sure you are familiar with, where companies, especially from, we call them the north or developed countries, would pay for maintaining or planting trees and biodiversity protection. There may be another area which may be water protection. For example, the downstream water users paying upstream farmers for adapting land uses that limit deforestation, soil erosion, and flooding risks. Then there may be also landscape beauty. For example, a tourism operator paying a local community not to hunt or protect a forest, or even for tourist viewing. I'll be showing some of the pictures. Then there is a new one which may be indirect, which I think is very important for developing countries, which would include, for example, payment of parks fees and sharing parks fees, the entry parks fees. Then there are some benefits as far as payment of ecosystem services is concerned. The first one, which is common, is, for example, clean development mechanism, which leads to introduction of clean technology, and like CDM in developing countries, of course, has such other benefits, such as planting of trees. Then investments also in CDM may also bring additional financial inflow to the country. They may bring in money. And there are also other social benefits, such as employment, as well as income-generating activities for rural communities. For example, the ecotourism services and the revenue that may be got from revenue sharing. Then it also provides opportunities to restore the ecosystems, especially as far as the partnership with local governments, environmental authorities, and development partners are concerned. So if there is a partnership, then the societies will be willing to restore the ecosystems. Now, so I'll quickly run through the legal and policy framework for implementing payment of ecosystem services in Uganda. In other words, do we have the relevant laws that can help the implementation of payment of ecosystem services? the legal policy and frameworks are very important in two ways. Because one, this is a complex and, as maybe I mentioned, a complex subject, very new in Uganda, I'm sure in other developing countries, and therefore the existence of legal and policy framework becomes very, very important, and for two reasons. One, they specify the details of the process by assigning oversight, certification, monitoring responsibilities to government institutions, NGOs, and the private sector businesses. And more importantly, it provides rights and obligations that they regulate the operation or payment of ecosystem services that guide environmental conservation. Now, so the laws are several of them. We have the Constitution. The Constitution in Uganda really is very elaborate. It provides general provisions that deal with environmental management. For example, in the preamble, it has some requirements that the government of Uganda should comply with. For example, the requirement that the government of Uganda should protect important natural resources such as land, water, wetlands, and minerals, oil, fauna, and flora on behalf of people of Uganda, and also to take practical measures to promote good water management system. Also, in the preamble, it talks about sustainable development. It talks about the need to take measures to minimize to prevent and minimize damage and destruction to the environment, and so the need to promote and implement energy policies that will ensure that people's basic needs and those of environment preservation are met. Then also together with the citizens of the country, it requires that they need to protect and promote the culture preservation of public property and the Uganda's and heritage. Then it talks about the need to protect national parks, and it brings in the concept of public trust, whereby the important resources are supposed to be protected on behalf of the citizens of Uganda, which of course all of these are very important for the of ecosystem services. Then in 1994, Uganda developed the environmental policy, and it has very important provisions as far as payment of ecosystem services are concerned. So in the interest of time, I will just highlight them, really. And it talks about the need for full environmental and social costs that must be taken care of as far as environmental damage is concerned. In other words, bring in the value of economic instruments as far as environmental protection is concerned. Then it also requires that the prices paid by resource users should reflect the cost of resource replacement and rehabilitation. And this is very, very important. Actually, when you present this to our politicians, they usually ask us, what do you gain, for example, from protecting frogs? What is the economic value of protecting frogs? So I think if we can appreciate this, then it becomes very important as far as payment of ecosystem services are concerned. Then the policy also talks about the establishment of concessions, management contracts, joint ventures, production sharing, and charging of fees for resource use, which I think is very, very important. Then we have the National Environment Act, which is a framework piece of legislation which establishes the Environmental Management Authority, which is responsible for coordinating and monitoring, and it acts as the supervisory body of all environmental matters in Uganda. This act has principles which are very important as far as payment of ecosystem services are concerned. In the interest of time, I will highlight the major ones. One is to reclaim lost ecosystems where possible and reverse the degradation of natural resources to ensure to ensure, for the regulation of natural resources. And then it brings in the concept of polluter pays principle, which I think is very, very, very important. I think the previous presenter talked about it. There were regulations that were made under the National Environment Act, and again, these regulations emphasize the payment of a fee for storage and transportation of wastes. And the Act also talks about the need to develop regulations that deal with commercial exploitation of forest resources. Then we have the forestry policy that was developed in 2001. Again, it has important provisions that are important as far as payment of ecosystem services is concerned, because it requires that there is a need to ensure economic and social environmental opportunities without undermining the resource base. Then it also recognizes the role of private sector in developing and managing commercial forest plantation. As you can see, all of these are important as far as payment of ecosystem services are concerned. Then in 2009, Uganda developed the National Forestry Plan, and it has specific provisions that deal with the need to promote incentives to encourage private sector involvement in tree planting activities, and also it encourages involvement in tree planting and accessing global financing mechanisms for forestry activities, such as the World Bank Carbon Funds, the carbon trading financing, under the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol and the UNFCCC. Then we have the Act, which was made in 2003, the National Forestry and Tree Planting Act. This Act, for the first time, we have a law that emphasizes the need to have collaborative management as far as management of the forestry, of the forest resources concerned. And this collaboration management, of course, has some economic incentives. Then we have the wildlife policy, which deals with the management of wildlife resources in Uganda. This one also has very important provisions that are relevant as far as payment of ecosystem services are concerned. For example, it encourages tourism development so as to generate revenue from tourism to support wildlife conservation efforts and the national economy. Then it also empowers the executive director to enter into a memorandum of understanding that provide mutual benefits to both the communities and conservation authorities. Then it provides a very important provisions which is called revenue sharing, which means that the money collected from the entry fees of the national parks are supposed to be shared with the local communities neighboring the national parks. In other words, they are supposed to get 20% of the parks entry fees from the protected areas, which I think was a very important innovation. Then it also talks about the need to have investment subsidies and user charges. That's the Water Act, sorry. Then the water policy talks about that costs to be collected and administered by the user association must be recognized at every stage. Then the Water Act introduces, again, a fee for water discharge and also establishes recovery costs for the use and major environmental damage from polluters. In other words, any person who wishes to construct any works or take or use any water has to apply for the water permit and must pay the fees, the relevant fees, which of course is very useful as far as the use of water is concerned. Then we have the Land Act, where this is general because it recognizes that whoever owns land must occupy it and manage it in accordance with the relevant environmental laws in Uganda. And also the Land Act recognizes the public trust doctrine. Then the Local Government Act, which deals with decentralization, also empowers the local governments to manage environmental and natural resources. And mind you, some of these natural resources management, of course, are based at the districts. Then I would like to, of course, highlight some of the projects that have been implemented in Uganda as far as payment of ecosystem services are concerned. Now, the first one is FACE and FACE project with our Uganda Wildlife Authority. Under this project, there is a contract. It is in the Mount Elgon, whereby they are supposed to finance the forests. In return, then they get the carbon dioxide sequestration. There are some challenges, of course, in this project because, first of all, the communities don't understand this project, and there are also contractual problems. Then there is the Nile Basin project with the Forestry Authority. Also, well, in the interest of time, I will not go through all of this, but the most important element of this project is that it involves the communities to plant indigenous trees adjacent to the protected areas, which I think is very, very important. Then this is an example of the Nile Basin project. You can see the trees that have been planted. Then there is also another project, International Small Group Project, which is between UCID. Then there is also another project, Trees for Global Benefit of Plant Revival. It involves DFID and also EcoTrust, where actually I happen to be a board member because it involves also management and planting of indigenous trees. Then the West Nile project, this is very important because it deals with rural electrification projects with the World Bank. Then there's another project of Bwindi, which is a national park which involves the conservation of the national park. And the revenue collected, again, is supposed to be shared with the local communities. And because of that, they have been able to develop some projects. So I wanted to show you how it is already working. This is a gorilla safari, 3 days, 1,090. Luxury is 15,000. So you can book now. It's a very beautiful place. So that you also contribute to the payment of ecosystem services. This is a gorilla, so I encourage you to come and see. It's very beautiful. Then the revenue sharing project. I have already talked about it. Then I have already talked about the collaborative management project, which is between the Uganda Life Authority and FAA. Then the ecotourism, which I have talked about. And maybe I should show you. Again, this is an example of ecotourism, Budong Eco Lodge. There is a lodge there, and that's part of the ecosystem project. My time is over. Then maybe I should also mention the challenges, the institutional framework, because challenges, for example, there's no real government institution that is really participating in this. This is usually done by government partners and NGOs. That's a challenge. Then another challenge regards who should really manage and distribute payments. Because in Uganda, when you pay the money, it goes to the consolidated funds. So this money may end up buying some guns, maybe, or to go and, of course, participate in a peacekeeping mission in Somalia. So it may not go back to cover, of course, environmental services. Then we still have, I think somebody talked about the issue of property rights. You see, that's a challenge because some people who are participate do not have land titles, and those who participate, especially women, do not own the land. So the issue of property rights and land tenure becomes a problem. Then another challenge is that we don't have a specific policy or law that deals with payment of ecosystem services. As you can see, I was trying to get from here and there. Then the monitoring is still a problem. Then the equity issues. You know, these are companies who come to Uganda with experts, and they are negotiating with the peasants. Really, do these peasants understand these issues? So that's a big challenge. Then political support, again, this is something new. People don't understand it. Then local community participation, again, the local people don't understand it. There is also a problem of information. Then the experts are not there also. Now the conclusion is that, I'm finishing, Madam Chair, is that really this is a good thing for Uganda, as I've said, because of the fact that we have the natural resources. And some work is already going on, but it could be improved. So how do we improve this? First of all, there is a need to enhance local communities' capacities to deal with international investors, because these are people who have come to make money, but not actually to protect the environment. So the local communities may not be able to deal with them unless they have the capacity. Then there is a need, of course, to have a comprehensive policy and legal framework that really defines the rights and obligations. There's also the need to raise awareness. Do people appreciate this? As I've said, the politicians in our countries do not understand the importance of payment of ecosystem services. Then there is a need really to have a government institution that is more involved rather than leaving the whole thing to NGOs and also the donor communities. So in the interest of time, I couldn't give you the details because I respect the chair, and that's what I would like to share with you, but we can continue the debate. This is a very important thing, after my presentation, and maybe during dinner or there is a cocktail. We can also discuss more during the cocktail. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Have you any question? Yes.
My question is about, I want to know the driver of degradation and deforestation, in Uganda, because we talk about phase project, but they try to, what they try to do is to reduce deforestation or degradation, or which kind of driver? Which kind of driver is important in Uganda, in terms of degradation of environmental resources in Uganda? That's my first question. The second one is, I see you talk about the legal framework of Uganda, and you say that in 1994, payment for ecosystem services was considered by the legal framework of Uganda. But okay, I don't know if I have the very good information, because the first application of payment for ecosystem services, I mean, it was after 1994, 1997 in Costa Rica. I don't know if the legal framework of Uganda apply the payment for ecosystem services, or is just some provision who refer to payment for ecosystem services. That is my second question. And yeah, that's it. Yeah.
The first question, I didn't get it clear well, but my understanding.
I want to know the driver of degradation or if there is deforestation. What is the problem in environmental resource in Uganda? What is the driver?
Oh, okay. Of course.
The destructive driver factor of.
Of course, if you have read some, if you have read some materials, the level of degradation, environmental degradation, has been high. Actually, we've lost, I think, they say almost 30% of our forest cover, which we used to have before, because of because of fuel wood. We do that. And recently we're having even a bigger problem because of development projects, whereby the government is giving forest land to establish industries. And I think that one is also increasing. So I'm not saying that the degradation has been reduced. If anything, it is going, it is increasing because of poor implementation of our laws. And actually there is also a conflict between development, the balance between development and environmental protection. Especially the policymakers don't understand. The argument is, why should people starve when we have forests? Why shouldn't we have industries that will create employment, that will increase the foreign exchange? But they do not, as I've said, appreciate the economic value of protecting the forest. So it has increased, definitely. Now, now the issue of having provision that deal with employment of ecosystem services. Actually, when you know the history of Uganda, you know, Uganda actually since 1990 was among the first country actually, I don't know whether it was because of the history and the donors liked us, among the few countries that came up with one of the best environmental policies and laws, actually. We were actually among the countries that started with what they call the framework environmental protection. So this policy of 1994 was because of the National Environment Action Plan, which was the World Bank project. And when you read through, it's a very good policy, actually. Maybe the question should be, why didn't we implement it? Why didn't we start? Now that is another question, but these provisions are there, and the biggest challenge is, or still is, that the level of implementation is still poor. Though we started later, but actually I was even told when I was doing my research, Uganda was, after Canada, the second country to develop the wetlands policy. So you can see we've been developing very good policies, but the problem is implementation. So they are there. I can share with you. I think I have a soft copy if you want to look at it, but these provisions are there, except we don't implement them properly.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Yves Le Boutillier, University of Ottawa. Emmanuel, just a couple of factual questions and more a question regarding legal regime. You mentioned fuel wood. I read somewhere that 93% of the energy for eating and so on come from fuel wood in Uganda, which is a really high number. So I was wondering whether there's any significant changes in that regard in the last few years. With regard to all these projects, plantation of trees, do you know if there's a concern with regard to the loss of biodiversity because of monocultures? And also, do you know if there's been public involvement or if there have been evictions in some of those projects? And then the last one is that, you know, you referred to a lot of legislation, but do you think that there is a need to review that legislation that you referred to, given the emergence of the recognitions of ecosystem services? In other words, would you think that you should, the government, with the involvement of the public, should look back at all this legislation and say, to what extent does it really provide for ecosystem services? You mentioned that 20% for parks, but do you think there's a need to, you know, have a second look at all these legislation that are relevant for ecosystem services and update them? So.
Okay, there were three questions. The first one is the fuel wood. Yeah, of course, it is a problem for two reasons. One, we use hydroelectric power, which is very expensive. And though we have just launched Bujagari, but it's still a problem. And even personally, I also use fuel wood, though I'm supposed to protect those. It is unreliable and very expensive. And also, there is also a cultural problem. You see, the food cooked by fuel is not the same as food cooked by a cooker. So I don't think really there is a significant change as far as the use of fuel oil is concerned, though they have there's rural electrification projects going on. But the problem, in my view, is that electricity is still too expensive considering our income and it is not going to have a significant impact unless we come up with maybe fewer wood preservation stoves, which may be cheaper than electricity. Now, the issue of public involvement in projects, in my view, is still controversial because the laws do require that there should be public participation in all projects. The law is very clear. But again, the problem is that do people understand their obligations or their rights as far as public interest, rather public involvement in the projects is concerned? The answer is no, because the time I participated in the project, I would interview people. I think they had been coached. They would talk about how much they are going to get, the jobs they are going to get. So I think there is still a problem because, first of all, there is a lot of influence. It becomes a political issue. And secondly, some of these documents are still in English, and not every Ugandan really would understand the terminologies in some of these documents. So when they are there, they're there to listen and see maybe a good presentation, but not actually to effectively participate in these projects. Yeah. Then the review of legislation, yeah, it is going on, but in my view, it is very slow. You see, Uganda started very well, but later, I think we got confused somewhere. That's why actually the government is now a little bit slow as far as developing environmental legislation is concerned. At the speed we had in the 90s, in my humble view, is that has become slower because the government has realized that the more you empower local people, the more they will become radical, and the more they will become aware, and the more they may oppose some of these political decisions. So in my view, apart from legislation that deal with political issues, I think the review of environmental legislation that covers some of these important elements is slower because of the political situation that we have in the country. I don't know whether I have covered all of the questions.
I'm sorry. I think we have to move on. I'm sure there's many more questions, but I think we need to move on to the next speaker at this point. Is that right, Madam Moderator?
Sorry, because I have to stop this interesting debate. And now it's time to listen to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would like to thank everybody and IUCN Academy of Environmental Law, and also Daniele Mamed, that is not here, but this work we had made together, and it was a part of her master research at the University of Amazonas, and now she's working with Professor Elini in Catholic University of Paraná, and we are still dealing with these subjects, forest protected areas and the payment for ecosystem services. Let's see. I would like to try to answer to 3 questions in our debate in this morning. The first one is if it's possible to understand that this compensation for traditional population in protected areas works as a type, as a kind of payment for ecosystem services. Secondly, what does this strategy mean, taking into account Brazilian law and also the view of different actors? And as different actors, I would like to highlight the position of civil society and a lot of things that I have heard in People's Summits in Rio +20 this month. And also if compensation can help to reduce poverty and social equity. And so let's go. Firstly, I would like to stress this first part of talking about forest protected areas and ecosystem services in Brazil, most generally, and after take into account the example of Reserva do Juma in Amazon region and the payment of ecosystem services. As we talk about ecosystem services in Brazil, we need to consider the protected areas, the forests, and also the Brazilian constitutions, and infra-constitutional law, and the new forest code of 2012. Firstly, our constitution says a lot of things. Okay, we have the right to an ecological balanced environment, and in order to ensure the effectiveness of these rights, it's incumbent upon the government, the three levels of the government, union, states, and municipalities, to preserve and restore the essential ecological process. Here we can see, or we can have some lights for taking into account ecosystem services. But it incumbents also to the government define in all units of the Federation territorial spaces or protected areas and their components which are to receive special protection. And finally, our Constitution also states that the Brazilian Amazonian forests is part of the national patrimony and shall be used as provided by law under conditions which ensure the preservation of the environment, therein included the use of mineral resources. I would like to pass or say to make a movement from law to reality. And so this is what we call Brazilian Legal Amazon, that includes 10 states and 61% of our territory. And I will talk about forests and rainforests, and so Amazon rainforests and protected area in this area, and also the services, the ecosystem services. Here we have a map of deforestation that are produced in 2010 by an NGO, showing in red what we have as an arc of deforestation. I mean, what's still pressuring the deforestation of our rainforest. And we can say that even if in 2010 we had the rate of deforestation that was the lowest one since 1988, it still amounts to 1 million football fields. Of course that here we are in a baseball field, but let's think about how bigger continues the deforestation in Amazon rainforest. We are real in a crossroad, and I think that this conference, thinking about global environmental law at a crossroads, give to us the opportunity to think about the mechanisms on global level, but also in local level. Because if we do not change things on local level, things will not change. And so we need to think about law on local level. And there's not only forests in this region, there are people, but what does it represent? How much people there are in this region, and how is the economy? We can talk about 5% of the GDP, gross domestic product, 10% of urban population, and 12% of total population of Brazil. But we can talk about this pressure increasing each time, because if you take into account 1917 till 2000, we can see that the population has increased 172%. Let's talk, and so moving back from reality to law, about how can we protect this region, and if services, ecosystem services, payment for ecosystem services are mechanisms that we can apply in this region. Protected areas are, in Brazilian law, infra-constitutional law, in forest code, and in a law of units of conservation, and also indigenous reservations. But I will talk about these first two laws. The Forestry Code of 2012, the new Forest Code, that still have the areas of permanent preservation, or what I mean, the areas that have the environmental function of preserving water, resources, landscape, geological stability, biodiversity, fauna and flora, gen flow, protecting the soil, and also assuring human well-being. And legal reserve, areas in rural property or rural possession, economic use of improving the economic use of natural resources. And this legal reserve corresponds to 80% of rural property in forest areas on legal Amazon, 35% of the rural property in savanna areas of the legal Amazon, and 20% of the rural property in the other regions of the country. Néanmoins, but yes, because it's my French side here. But the new Forest Code has diminished all these areas. For example, the top of the mountains are out of protection nowadays in Brazil. Only if we have higher than 1,800 that we have protection of the top of the mountain. All along the rivers, there was a great reduction of these areas, and also legal reserve. We can talk about a reduction, because they said that wherever we do not have legal reserve, we will consider that people do not have the obligation to restore it. And even if civil society and all the movement all around the world said to our president that it was necessary to veto this bill has passed, and we still have a confusing moment now, or insecurity now, because we have had this bill that has passed with some vetoes, and after, as we call, a provisional measure that restored the bill that was passed firstly in the Senate, and we must wait till 8 October to see if the Congress will pass finally or not these changes. And so what there is interesting is that this new Forest Code says that we can have the federal executive power authorized to establish a program to support and encourage the conservation of the environment, as well as adoption of technologies and best practice that balance agriculture and forest productivity, by adopting the mechanism of payment or incentive for environmental services in return, monetary or not, for conservation activities and improvement of ecosystem and environmental services. This payment or incentive for environmental services take into account services that management, such as individually or cumulatively, sequestration, conservation, reduced carbon flux, natural scenic beauty, biodiversity conservation, water services, the regulation of climate, cultural and traditional ecosystems knowledge, the soil, and the maintenance of areas of permanent preservation, legal reserve, and restricted use. It means that now we starting to have this possibility on the federal level, but we had already some programs, some projects that implemented this mechanism, this strategy of payment for ecosystem services. For example, what we called Water Production Program, developed by our National Agency of Waters. But taking into account the protected areas, or more specifically biodiversity protection, we have our national system of conservation unities, and in the Amazon region we had in 2010 307 conservation unities. and that represents 23% of this big territory that I had showed to you before. And we have two kinds of conservation unities. Unities of complete protection, that it means that we don't want to have human interference. It's like national parks, biological reserves, and on the other hand, conservation units of sustainable use when we have the possibility to have a population inside. It's in this case that we will talk about Reserva do Juma in Amazon region. This reserve was established by the Amazon state government, state level, through a decree of July 2006 at the city of New Aripuanã in the state of Amazonas. And there are traditional population, 44 communities with 378 families, and they have registered in 2009 1,668 residents, and that benefits of this program called Bolsa Floresta, and delivered 319 cards. This project is a project of reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, RED. And there is an international certification of World Rainforest Movement. But moving from law to reality, let's see, and come on with me. Where are we now? This is the tropical rainforests in the world. And so let's go to South America, Brazil. You can see this part that is in yellow is Manaus, is the capital of the state of Amazonas. And this part in red is what we call the Sustainable Development Reserve of Juma. To go from Manaus to there, by boat, it's more than 12 hours. To have an idea, it means that when we decided to make this research, we do not have had at this time funds, but it costs almost $100 only the means of transportation to do this little research. And so this program called Bolsa Floresta has 4 axes. One of them is Bolsa Floresta Family. A lot of people knows more this first one. Bolsa Floresta Association, Bolsa Floresta, Social Bolsa Floresta, and Bolsa Floresta Income. The first one provides a payment of monthly quantum. This compensation, it's about $30 American to families living in these protected areas. And the Bolsa Floresta Association is 10% of the sum of all Bolsa Floresta family, and the aim is to strengthen the basis of community organization. The Bolsa Floresta Social is paid also per family per year to be invested in improving education, healthy communication and transportation the inhabitants of this protected area. And finally, Bolsa Floresta Income is paid per family per year, designed to support sustainable production. The chosen activities may not result in deforestation. This research, Daniela went there for 3 days, and she had some interviews. She interviewed people to know what they think about Bolsa Floresta, if they know about this program, what it means for their life. And it was very interesting, because some of these, many people do not have the exactly knowledge of what it means, the payment for environmental or for ecosystem services. They are grateful of receiving these funds, we can say that, of course, these funds reduce poverty, but the amount that they receive, for example, they must expend half of this amount only with oil to go to the main community to receive these funds. And so we need not only this strong marketing, because it was a very strong marketing that was made about this Reserva do Juma, but we need institutional conditions. And when I say institutional conditions, I would like to highlight that I think that we need independent researchers to know if we can really implement this kind of mechanisms. And information, participation and transparency, I think that we need to increase and also empowering these communities. Because, and finding this in this morning, my speech, I think that we need to balance. Maybe the payment for an ecosystem services has limits. What I would like to mean, when we say we need a seller, we need a buyer, we are talking about a service. Usually a service is provided by a human being to another human being. And so we tried to take it and to put a color, a legal color on this, saying, okay, and so it's nature, but it's people that are taking care of the nature. But after, when we think about the polluter principle, and we said, oh, but we will pay for these people not to pollute. And so if I bring to the economic field, I will say, oh, but yes, for this, okay, I will pay, but for other people's, I will not pay. But who needs to be paid to protect the nature? I think that it's the real question that we must think about. Because, for example, when I talk about law in Brazil, we have the principle of social function of the property. And maybe for the eco-business, for the greatest landowner, we do not need to support them economically, because they must improve this principle, and it's stated on our constitutional that the rural property must observe the preservation of the environment. It's in our constitutional, but okay, let's say that when they think about Brazilian constitution, they put a lot of things on that and say people will never think that it can be implemented. And so because of this, I think that we can think about the payment of ecosystem services as a way of retribution and environmental justice associated with biodiversity conservation, but for this it's necessary transparency, and the population must be involved all along the process. We call foreign in Brazil gringo. And sometimes we said, yes, we make that for gringos see that everything is all right. I think that we must do this really and think about payment of ecosystem services not as a miracle solution, but empowering also communities and recognizing their rights to that they can and they do contribute till now to the preservation of biodiversity and support the forest conservation and forest protection in Amazon region. Periodical evaluation by independent researchers should be made to ascertain the level of awareness and participation of the traditional population involved and the benefits in terms of forest protection and social equity. And finally, thank you for having heard me, and I think that we need not only as lawyers to bring solutions to things, but to think what they bring to us and how we deal with these mechanisms and what are the effects of these mechanisms when they are implemented. Thank you very much. Obrigada.
If there is so many questions, yes?
Solange, if there were a serious attempt to implement payments for ecological services in the Amazon, how much money, not in dollars, but what magnitude of money and where would it come from?
This is one of the points, because we talk about two things. We can talk about the international level or the countries, who you pay for to whom. If it's Australia or the United States, they will pay to Brazil to stay with the forests there. And so I think that this is one of the points that was discussed this morning and is in the field of the climate change convention negotiations. And it will bring us money, but I think that in the international level we need to be more closely to local level to implement this kind of mechanisms, because if not, we can talk about the highest level of corruption in the Amazon region in Brazil. And so we need to say things as they are. Okay? And so I think that, yes, the planet is only one. We will need to have this solidarity between countries, but more than that, I think that we will need to have this solidarity between people. And we will have to improve this, maybe recognizing their rights and empowering them to know how much they have already contributed to the forest preservation, and also, in other hand, giving to them also healthy and a lot of things, because these communities are so, the poverty there is so big that sometimes I'm even ashamed that we talk about them and we never ask them, what do you want? Sometimes it's healthy care, is a pair of shoes, is, you know, and I think that who must pay, I think that we must negotiate in international level, this is sure. And the problem is how we will implement it. I think that more maybe that who will pay, even if we have a financial crisis now, etc., etc.
Another question? Yes?
My name is Wang Xi from China. As I know, the ecosystem in Amazon is globally very important. We call it the lung of the earth. Okay? But since 1992, the global society, it seems to me, make very little progress on the status of ecosystem, particularly the forests in Amazon. Do you see any progress has been made since 1992 on the value of ecosystem or the value of the tropical forest in the Amazon area in the international society? Do you see any new progress made by governments of the world?
You want to know if I see any progress in the protection of Amazon region, or
recognize the value of Amazon by countries of the world since 1992? Any new progress? Because you are people in this area.
I think that we have had a progress in our discourse. I think that, for example, we have the organization of Amazonia Cooperation Treaty. And so we have started thinking about how to preserve effectively the Amazon region. We have a project, for example, in the state of Pará that is for land tenure, that it's very interesting, and because it's a region of a lot of conflicts of lands. But I think that we still need to progress more quickly. I think the urgency is now, and there is a big difference between Brazilian discourse, international one, saying that yes, we would like to protect Amazon, and in domestic level, I think that this new forest code is a big disaster for us and for the world. And if we do not have international pressure, we will not change. Because now, like China, we are part of the BRICS, and we are part of the developed or emerging countries that want to be developed quickly. To give an example, they are planning to build more than 20 dams in Amazon region. And so if in one side we have more knowledge of how it represents the deforestation, in other hand, the urgency and the mechanisms, we are going slowly, so slowly that I'm afraid. I do not want to be catastrophist, there's a French author that said that catastrophisme éclairé. But I think that we need maybe to change our point of view only of law and deal with multidisciplinary groups and have this multidisciplinary approach to try to change the way that we are going on. Maybe in this sense, payment for ecosystem services may be interesting, but with limits. I don't think that it's a miracle solution.
So I think your presentation is very important because in international society, since 1992, there is no big progress on this issue. So this workshop and your presentation is very important.
Yes.
We know that in 1992, the forest negotiation failed. Since then, nothing new happened, so it's a pity. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was the last question, I'm sorry, because now we have to lunch. And I invite you to continue this debate during the lunch. Thank you very much.
Thank you.